Walter Briggs, a 62-year-old veteran, faces rejection in a changing town that no longer values him. His garage, his lifeline, is seized for a parking lot, and a barista publicly humiliates him. Silent and stoic, Walter carries his pain alone until a convoy of luxury cars arrives. Former soldiers, now successful, return to honor the man who saved their lives in Iraq. They gift him a new garage, a fresh start. As Walter steps into the cafe again, the town's eyes open. But what happens next? Will they truly remember him? Love stories of honor and humanity? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like Walter's. Share this video to spread his story and leave a comment about a quiet hero in your life. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive. Join us today. Walter Briggs stood frozen in the sterile glow of the cafe, his work boots planted on the polished hardwood as the barista's words cut through him like a jagged knife. "We don't serve people like you here." Her voice was a whip, sharp and laced with contempt, echoing off the exposed brick and the overpriced latte machines. At 62, Walter was a man whose face had been carved by time, sunbaked, grease-streaked, and unyielding. But his eyes, those deep hazel pools, betrayed the storm raging within. Shock flickered first, then pain, raw and unguarded, followed by a quiet, smoldering anger he'd learned to bury long ago. The cafe's patrons, their noses buried in laptops or their fingers swiping screens, didn't stir. No one met his gaze. No one dared challenge her. The silence was a heavier blow than her words, pressing against Walter's broad chest like the weight of a grenade he'd once held in trembling hands. With a slow, deliberate pivot, he turned and walked out, each step measured, his pride a burden heavier than any he'd carried through the blistering sands of Iraq. But fate had other plans, and within a day, the town that had shunned him would face a moment that would sear itself into their collective memory. Walter was a man of steel and silence, his hands etched with scars from decades of wrestling engines, and his soul tempered by the fires of Desert Storm. At 62, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had marched through deserts under a merciless sun, who had hoisted transmissions that would buckle lesser men. He didn't speak of his service, not out of shame, but because the weight of it lived in his bones. The calluses on his palms told of nights spent patching up Humvees under fire, and the faded photograph above his workbench, showing a younger Walter with his platoon, spoke of bonds forged in blood and dust. For 20 years, Briggs Auto Service had been his anchor, a small garage on Elm Street where the red bricks had weathered to a rusty glow and the hand-painted sign creaked like an old friend in the breeze. It wasn't much to look at, but it was honest. Honest like the sweat on Walter's brow. Honest like the work he poured into every car, every life that crossed his threshold. In the old days, Elm Street had been a community stitched together by small gestures. Kids pedaled by on bikes, their laughter trailing as they waved at Walter, who'd pause to wipe grease from his hands and wave back. Neighbors brought their cars for repairs, often lingering to share gossip or drop off a slice of pie. The church parked its bake sales and fundraisers in his lot, and Walter never turned them away. When Mrs. Donnie's heater failed in the heart of a brutal winter, he worked through the night to fix it, shrugging off her tearful gratitude and her offer of payment. When a single mother's car sputtered to a stop, stranding her before a double shift, Walter filled her tank, changed her oil, and sent her off with a gruff, "Pay it forward when you're able." He wasn't chasing glory, he'd tell you that himself, but he believed in doing right, in fixing what was broken, whether it was an engine or a person's hope. But the town had shifted beneath his feet. The bait shops and hardware stores that once defined Elm Street had been swallowed by boutiques with frosted glass and cafes serving drinks with names no one could pronounce. Towering condos cast long shadows over the sidewalks, their sleek designs a stark contrast to the cracked pavement Walter knew by heart. Yoga studios and artisanal bakeries replaced laundromats and diners, and the people who filled the streets walked with a brisk, detached air, their smiles rare and fleeting. Walter's regulars, the folks who'd known him by name, were fewer now. Newcomers glanced at his grease-stained jacket and weathered face with a mix of curiosity and disdain, as if he were a curiosity from a bygone era. The town that had once felt like a warm hearth was growing cold, its roots yanked out and replaced with something polished and hollow. Walter felt it deep in his chest. He was becoming a stranger in the place he'd called home. Then came the letter, delivered on a crisp Tuesday morning. Its white envelope was deceptively plain, creased at the edges, stamped with the city's seal. But Walter knew its weight before he even touched it, a sinking dread that settled in his gut like a stone. His calloused fingers lingered at the flap, hesitating as if the paper might bite. When he finally tore it open, the words inside were as cold as a winter wind. Notice of eminent domain acquisition. His garage, his haven, his life's work, was being claimed by the city. In 30 days, it would be razed to make way for a multi-level parking structure, a sterile monument to progress in the growing foot traffic of a downtown that no longer needed men like him. No hearing, no appeal. Just a bureaucratic edict that his purpose was obsolete. Walter stood in the heart of his shop, the letter trembling in his grip. The oil-stained concrete beneath him was the only thing that felt real. He'd faced mortar rounds whistling through the air, the stain of sand in his eyes, the screams of soldiers he'd dragged to safety. But this was a different kind of war. This was betrayal, served on city letterhead. After the battles, after the decades of fixing cars and lives, after pouring his heart into a town that once called him neighbor, his reward was a demolition crew and a parking pass. The city didn't offer gratitude. It demanded he step aside. That night, sleep was a distant stranger. Walter sat in his worn armchair, the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of his porch swing fading into the background. Buddy, his old hound, barked faintly at some shadow in the yard, but nothing could quiet the ache in Walter's chest. The letter's words replayed in his mind, each one a hammer blow to the life he'd built. He thought of the soldiers he'd saved, their faces etched in his memory. He thought of the townsfolk he'd helped, the small kindnesses he'd offered without expecting anything in return. He thought of the town that had forgotten him, eager to pave over his legacy. But beneath the pain, beneath the weight of his pride, a spark of defiance flickered. Walter Briggs wasn't finished. Not yet. The letter in Walter's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a raw, unspoken betrayal that cut deeper than any fire or storm he'd faced in his life. Its words, cold and formal, announced the end of Briggs Auto Repair, his life's work, as if it were nothing more than a footnote in the town's march toward progress. He stood in his garage that night, the weight of the news pressing against his chest, his heart heavy with a grief he couldn't name. The silence around him was louder than the roar of engines that had once filled this place. He felt the sting of abandonment, not just by the town, but by the very idea of a belonging he'd held onto for so long. The next morning, Walter rose with the dawn, his resolve unshaken despite the ache in his soul. He dressed carefully, his old flannel shirt pressed, his boots polished, as if presenting himself to the town council was a sacred duty. At the hearing, he stood at the podium, hat clutched tightly in his weathered hands, his voice steady but laced with a quiet, burning anger. He spoke of the kids he'd hired over the years, nervous teenagers who'd learned the value of a day's work under his patient guidance. He told of the veterans he'd pulled back from the edge, offering them not just jobs, but a purpose, a reason to keep going. He described the countless neighbors whose cars he'd fixed without ever expecting a thank you. Their gratitude shown in small gestures, a plate of cookies at Christmas, a handshake that lingered a little longer than necessary. He poured out what it meant to be part of a community, to be woven into its fabric through years of sweat and sacrifice. But as he spoke, he felt the room's indifference like a cold wind. The chairs behind him, where supporters might have sat, were mostly empty. A few city hall clerks scribbled notes, their heads bowed, avoiding his gaze. When he finished, a young councilman, polished and detached, his Bluetooth headset blinking like a beacon of modernity, gave a curt nod. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Briggs," he said, his tone as dismissive as if he were commenting on a routine weather update. "But progress can't wait." The words landed like a slap, and Walter felt the weight of his own obsolescence settle into his bones. That afternoon, as he drove along the edge of town, his pickup rattling over familiar roads, Walter spotted a woman stranded beside her car. The hood was up, steam curling into the air, and her face was a mask of desperation, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her phone. Without hesitation, he pulled over, his own troubles momentarily forgotten. He rolled up his sleeves, the familiar rhythm of work grounding him, and set to fixing the problem with the quiet focus that had defined him for decades. The woman, flustered and overwhelmed, tried to press a few crumpled bills into his hand when he was done. Walter shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. "Keep it," he said, wiping his hands on a rag he kept tucked in his back pocket. "You've got enough to deal with today." She looked at him, her eyes softening with gratitude, and for a moment Walter felt the flicker of connection that had always driven him to show up for others. It was who he was, a man who fixed things, who carried others' burdens even when his own were heavy. Back at the garage that morning, the air was still, heavy with the scent of oil and steel. No engines hummed, no radio played the oldies that had always kept him company. Only the creak of the door hinges and the echo of his boots on the stained concrete floor broke the silence. Walter moved through the space with a deliberate slowness, his hands grazing each workbench, each tool as if committing them to memory. They were more than objects. They were extensions of himself, partners in a life built on hard work and quiet pride. On the far wall, faded by years of sunlight, hung a framed photograph of his army unit. Young men, their faces streaked with desert dust, stood shoulder to shoulder under a tattered flag, their grins defiant against the harshness of war. Walter's hand rested on the glass, his thumb brushing the edge of the frame, lingering over the face of a friend who never came home. The memory was a wound that never fully healed, and now closing this garage felt like losing another piece of himself. "Guess this is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking to the ghosts of his past. He flipped off the lights, the click of the switch final and hollow, and locked the door of Briggs Auto Repair for the last time. No fanfare, no farewell, just the quiet end of a chapter written in grease and grit. Across the street, a new café had sprung up, all sleek lines and modern charm. Bean and Bloom, or some such name, with its bright white tiles and Edison bulbs casting a warm glow. Walter figured he'd grab a coffee, maybe sit by the window and let his thoughts settle. But as he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter hushed, heads turned, and eyes lingered on his grease-stained jacket and worn boots. He didn't belong here, not in this world of oat milk lattes and laptop screens. The young barista behind the counter, her expression sharp and unwelcoming, arched an eyebrow. "We don't serve people like you here," she said, her voice cutting through the room, loud enough to ensure everyone heard. Walter blinked, the words landing like a punch to the gut. "Just wanted a black coffee," he said quietly, his tone even despite the humiliation. She scoffed, her words dripping with disdain. "This isn't some gas station or that dumpy garage of yours. Good riddance. Maybe now this town can finally move forward." A few patrons glanced up, then quickly away, their silence louder than any protest. No one spoke up. No one stood for him. Walter's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. With a slow, deliberate turn, he walked out, the bell above the door jingling faintly behind him. He kept walking, his steps measured, his face betraying no tears, no anger, just the quiet dignity of a man who had given everything and been discarded. Inside the cafe, the silence lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. The hiss of the espresso machine resumed, keyboards clicked awkwardly, and conversations restarted in hushed, uneasy tones, as if trying to erase the moment. Two college students by the window exchanged glances. "That was harsh," one muttered, his voice tinged with unease. The other shrugged, dismissive. "Yeah, but wasn't that his old garage they tore down? I heard he went off at the council meeting." At the far end of the room, an older man in a corduroy jacket sat alone, stirring his coffee with a slow, deliberate motion. His weathered hands paused, his eyes fixed on the door Walter had passed through. He didn't speak, but his expression carried a quiet weight, a flicker of recognition. Almost imperceptibly, he nodded once, a solemn gesture of respect. A soldier acknowledging another who had fought battles no one else could see. The day had been heavy, the kind that clung to Walter like damp clothes after a storm. He sat on his porch as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in vibrant golds and muted grays, a fleeting masterpiece that felt almost too beautiful for the ache in his chest. His old dog, Buddy, lay sprawled beside him, his grizzled muzzle resting on Walter's worn boot, tail occasionally thumping against the weathered porch boards with a soft, rhythmic thud. The world beyond his small, modest home moved on without pause. Delivery trucks growled down the street, their engines a low hum of purpose, while a kid on a skateboard zipped by, the scrape of wheels against pavement cutting through the evening's quiet. No one spoke of what had happened earlier that day, the moment that had stripped away another piece of Walter's pride, leaving him raw and unseen in a town he had poured his life into. In his hands, he clutched a chipped ceramic mug, the coffee inside long gone cold, its bitter scent mixing with the faint musk of the evening air. Walter's eyes drifted over the street, past the neatly painted townhomes with their manicured lawns and glowing windows, where TVs flickered like fireflies behind drawn curtains. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The weight of the day pressed down on him, heavy as a sandbag slung across his shoulders. It wasn't just the loss of the garage, his life's work, the place where he'd fixed cars and traded stories with neighbors, where he'd felt useful, needed. It was the deeper sting of humiliation, the indifference in the eyes of those who'd once shaken his hand, the creeping sense that he was fading into invisibility in the very community he'd helped build. Every kind word he'd offered, every small act of service, every moment he'd thought mattered, it all felt like it was dissolving into the twilight. Buddy let out a soft, contented sigh, nudging Walter's leg with his nose, and Walter reached down absently, scratching behind the dog's ears. His gaze stretched beyond the street, somewhere far off, maybe back to the desert, where the air was thick with dust and danger, where a uniform had meant something, where no one had ever questioned whether he belonged. Back then, he'd carried the weight of lives on his shoulders, not just his own. He'd been a soldier, a leader, a man whose actions spoke louder than words. Now, sitting on this quiet porch, he felt like a ghost, tethered to a world that no longer saw him. He didn't cry, men like Walter didn't do that, but the pain sat heavy in his chest, a silent anchor, deep and unspoken, joining the other burdens he'd carried for years, the ones he'd never named aloud. Morning came as it always did, with the discipline of decades pulling Walter from his bed before the sun breached the horizon. He brewed a pot of strong coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen of his modest home, and took Buddy out to the porch, their new ritual since the garage was taken from him. The street was still, the air cool and crisp, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, unbroken except for the soft chirping of early birds. He settled into his chair, mug in hand, and watched the world wake up. But as the sun climbed higher, a low rumble stirred the stillness, a sound that didn't belong in this working-class corner of town. Walter's eyes lifted from his coffee, narrowing as a line of sleek, black vehicles rolled into view. Polished, foreign, their engines humming with a confidence that spoke of wealth or purpose, or maybe both. One by one, they turned onto his block. 2 BMWs, 3 Range Rovers, and at the front a Bentley so pristine it seemed to gleam with its own light. The convoy moved with precision, slow and deliberate, like a procession with a mission. Neighbors stirred, curtains twitching as curious eyes peered through blinds, phones appearing in hands to capture the unusual sight. This wasn't the kind of place where luxury cars rolled through, not in a neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and faded paint, where life was steady but unremarkable. The vehicles came to a gentle stop in front of Walter's home, their engines idling softly. He stood, his posture straightening instinctively, a reflex from years of service that no amount of time could erase. Buddy let out a low, curious bark, then settled at Walter's side, ears perked. From the lead car stepped a man in his late 30s, his navy suit crisp and tailored, his shoes spotless, reflecting the morning light. There was something in the way he moved, calculated, controlled, scanning his surroundings with a quiet intensity that felt familiar, like a memory Walter couldn't quite place. "Mr. Briggs?" the man asked, stepping onto the walkway, his voice steady but warm. "I'm Walter," he replied, his tone guarded but calm, his eyes searching the stranger's face for answers. The man's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried weight, like it held a story. "Captain Thomas Laird, or I used to be." The name hit Walter like a distant echo, a half-forgotten melody from a life he'd left behind. Before he could speak, Thomas continued, his voice softening, thick with something raw. "Iraq, Fallujah, convoy ambush, 2007. You pulled me out of a burning vehicle. I couldn't walk. You got me clear just before the second explosion. The memory crashed into Walter like a flash grenade, vivid and unrelenting. He saw it all again. The searing heat, the chaos of gunfire, the acrid smoke choking the air. He felt the weight of a young soldier slung over his shoulder. The burn of sand against his skin, the screams and the blood. That day, he'd dragged two others out as well, their faces blurred by time and trauma. He'd thought maybe one hadn't made it, the uncertainty a quiet scar he'd carried ever since. You made it, Walter said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if saying it aloud might break the moment. Thanks to you, Thomas replied, his eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. And so did Mason and Torres. We're all here. He turned, gesturing toward the vehicles behind him. Doors opened and men and women stepped out, older now but unmistakable in their bearing. Soldiers, survivors, shaped by the same crucible of war. They stood tall, their suits a stark contrast to the dusty fatigues of their past, but their eyes carried the same fire, the same unspoken bond forged in the desert. They weren't just here to visit. They were here because of Walter, because of a moment in a burning hellscape when he'd refused to let them go. Thomas took a step closer, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. I've spent years looking for you. I didn't know what happened after you retired, didn't know where you'd gone. But last week I saw your name in a local news story. A veteran losing his garage, his livelihood. It was you. I knew it was you. Walter's throat tightened, the weight of the past and present colliding in his chest. He didn't speak, couldn't find the words, but his eyes held Thomas's, and in that moment he felt seen. Not as the man the town had forgotten, but as the soldier who'd carried others to safety, who'd given everything and asked for nothing. The pain in his chest shifted, not gone but lighter, shared now by those who stood before him, who remembered what he'd tried so hard to bury. Walter stood in the dim light of the old garage, the familiar scent of oil and metal wrapping around him like an old friend. His calloused fingers traced the edge of a worn workbench, his mind heavy with the weight of years spent fixing cars, patching lives, and carrying burdens he rarely spoke of. The creak of the door snapped him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see Thomas step inside. His polished shoes a stark contrast to the grease-stained floor. Thomas paused, his eyes scanning the cramped space, and Walter felt a prickle of unease. He knew that look. Thomas wasn't just here to chat. Something bigger was coming. Something Walter wasn't sure he was ready for. Got a minute? Thomas asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made Walter's chest tighten. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag, his heart thudding with a mix of curiosity and dread. Thomas reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick leather folder with a care that suggested it held more than just papers. He extended it toward Walter, his expression soft but resolute, as if he were offering a piece of himself along with it too. Walter hesitated, his rough hands hovering, before finally accepting the folder. His brow furrowed, a storm of confusion and suspicion brewing behind his eyes. What was this? Another bureaucratic hurdle? Another empty promise? He opened the folder and his breath caught. Inside were documents, crisp and official, deeds, architectural sketches, business permits, bank certifications. Each page was a revelation, a carefully laid plan unfolding before him. The final sheet stole his focus, a rendering of a modern auto center, sleek and purposeful, with solar panels glinting on the roof, 5 spacious service bays, and a compact apartment nestled above. The address at the top read, Old Miller Property, Road 9, just beyond the town's edge. Walter's fingers tightened on the pages, his mind racing to process it all. A bigger space, updated equipment, room to grow. His throat tightened as he looked up at Thomas, his voice barely a whisper. This is real? Thomas nodded, his gaze unwavering. Every signature's in place. The land's bought. Construction starts next week. Fully funded. Me and a few others from the old unit. No loans, no strings attached. We even covered the first year's business tax. Walter's hands trembled, the papers rustling slightly as he tried to steady himself. The weight of it all, the generosity, the trust, the sheer scale of it, felt heavier than any wrench he'd ever lifted. His mind spun back to the war, to the blood and fire, to the moments he'd buried deep. Why would they do this? Why now? Thomas seemed to sense the question burning in Walter's silence. He stepped closer, his voice low but fierce with a conviction. You dragged me out of a burning Humvee, Walter, even when you were bleeding out yourself. You went back for Torres when the medevac was 10 minutes out, when everyone else thought it was too late. Wissing got to hold his daughter because of you. His words landed like blows, each one stirring memories Walter had fought to keep locked away. The screams, the heat, the weight of his brothers in his arms. He'd done what he had to, nothing more. But Thomas's eyes held a gratitude that made Walter's chest ache. You saved our lives, Briggs. You never asked for medals, never sought glory. You just went home and kept helping people, like you always did. Walter's gaze dropped to the folder, his fingers tracing the edges of the rendering. The sleek lines of the auto center felt like a dream, one he didn't dare believe in. His life had been a quiet one since he'd returned, fixing cars, keeping his head down, ignoring the whispers of a town that had long stopped seeing him. He'd grown used to the invisibility, the way people looked through him rather than at him. But this was different. This was his brothers, the men he'd fought beside, reaching across the years to pull him back into the light. His throat burned, and he cleared it, trying to find words. You didn't have to do this, he managed, his voice rough. We needed to, Thomas said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. This town might not see what you're worth, Walter, but we do. Beside him, Buddy, his old dog, let out a soft, contented sigh, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. Walter's lips twitched, the smallest smile breaking through the storm of emotions. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just as a mechanic, not just as a veteran, but as a man who mattered. The folder rested heavy in his lap, a tangible promise of a future he hadn't dared imagine. Later that morning, Walter stood on the sidewalk across from Bean and Bloom, the cafe he'd slipped out of just a day earlier, his heart still stinging from the barista's dismissive sneer. His hand rested lightly on Buddy's head, the dog's warmth grounding him as he stared at the cafe door. Behind him, Thomas and the other veterans stood in a quiet line, their suits crisp and their presence commanding, like a unit ready for a mission. Walter's stomach churned with doubt. Was this necessary? Did he need to walk back into that place, face those same judging eyes? You sure about this? He muttered, his voice barely audible. Thomas's nod was firm, his eyes steady. You don't need to prove anything, Walter. But they need to see you. The words settled over him, heavy with truth. Walter took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he steeled himself. He stepped off the curb, his boots heavy against the pavement, and pushed open the cafe door. The bell above jingled, a sharp sound that cut through the hum of conversation. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward him. The barista from yesterday stood behind the counter, her smug confidence gone, her face paling as she recognized him. Her mouth parted slightly, her eyes wide with something like fear or shame as the veterans filed in behind Walter, their presence filling the space with quiet authority. Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded attention. Yesterday, this man was mocked, dismissed, shamed, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the barista. But let me tell you who he really is. His voice rose, steady and clear, as he turned to address the entire cafe. This is Staff Sergeant Walter Briggs. He saved my life in Iraq. He pulled 3 of us from a burning convoy under enemy fire, risking his own life without a second thought. He earned 2 Bronze Stars and a commendation for valor. He never bragged, never asked for anything in return. And while this town forgot him, he never stopped giving back. The silence in the cafe was deafening. The barista stood frozen, her hands gripping the counter, her eyes darting between Walter and Thomas, searching for words that wouldn't come. In the back corner, an elderly man rose slowly, his spine bent with age but his movements deliberate. He raised a trembling hand in a crisp salute, his eyes locked on Walter's. The gesture was silent, but it spoke volumes, a recognition that needed no words. Then one by one the customers began to clap, a slow, hesitant sound that grew into a wave, filling the room with a warmth Walter hadn't felt in years. His chest tightened, his eyes stinging as he stood there, the weight of their acknowledgement pressing against the walls he'd built around himself. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to hide. He was Walter Briggs, and he was seen. The moment began quietly, like a spark catching in dry grass, tentative at first, but destined to spread. Walter Briggs stood motionless on the sidewalk, his broad shoulders squared, his face a mask of stoic reserve, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. A weight, long carried, beginning to lift. The cafe door swung shut behind him, sealing off the hum of conversation inside, but the silence that followed hung heavy in the street, thick as the morning fog that often cloaked the town. For the first time in years, the townsfolk truly saw him. Not as the quiet old man who shuffled through their streets, but as someone who had once stood taller than most. Walter blinked against the sunlight, the brightness jarring, as if he were stepping out of a shadow far darker than the dim interior of the cafe. Behind him, Thomas and the other veterans emerged, moving with a quiet purpose that needed no explanation. 11 former soldiers, men and women, young and old, each shaped by different wars and different wounds, fell into formation without a word. Their tailored suits, crisp and formal, contrasted with the casual rhythm of the small-town morning. Their postures were rigid, disciplined, every motion deliberate, as if the battlefield's lessons still guided their steps. The weight of their service clung to them, not as a burden, but as a quiet strength, etched into the way they carried themselves. Walter stood still, uncertainty flickering in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, what this moment meant. Then Thomas, his old friend, gave a subtle nod, a signal that carried the weight of shared history. One by one, the soldiers stepped forward, each pausing directly in front of Walter. Their movements were slow, deliberate, not for show, but for something far deeper. Each raised a hand in a salute, steady and unhurried, a gesture that spoke louder than words ever could. "We remember," it said. "We see you." Walter's lips tightened into a thin line, his jaw clenching as a tide of emotion surged within him. Gratitude, grief, and something softer, more fragile, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His hand rose instinctively, returning each salute with the same military precision that had defined him decades ago. His movements were slower now, weathered by time, but the meaning behind them was as sharp as ever. The moment rippled outward. A few curious faces pressed against the cafe's windows at first, drawn by the unusual sight. Then the sound of clapping broke the stillness, soft at first, like a hesitant breeze, but growing louder as more joined in. Passers-by stopped in their tracks. Cars slowed, drivers craning their necks to see what had paused the rhythm of the morning. Phones were raised, not in the careless frenzy of capturing a viral moment, but with a quiet reverence, as if those recording knew they were witnessing something sacred. A woman on a nearby bench dabbed at her eyes with the back of her hand, her breath catching as she watched the scene unfold. A man with gray streaking his beard removed his cap, holding it to his chest like a flag lowered in respect. Even the teenagers, who moments ago had been lost in their screens, now stood still, their phones forgotten, awed by the gravity of what they saw. Through the hush, a small voice pierced the air. "Is he a real hero, Mama?" a little boy asked, his tiny hand clutching his mother's, his wide eyes fixed on Walter. The mother looked down at her son, then across the street at the aging man, who stood steady as he returned each a salute. Her throat tightened, her voice catching for a moment before she found the words. "Yes," she said softly, her tone heavy with realization. "And we almost forgot him." Walter's head turned slightly at the sound, his guarded eyes softening, glimmering with something rare and unguarded. Not pride, not vindication, but the quiet relief of being seen. For years he had faded into the background of this town, a ghost among people chasing brighter, shinier things. But now, in this moment, he stood where he belonged, not because he had demanded that, but because he had earned it. No medals were pinned to his chest, no grand speeches were made. There was only the steady rhythm of salutes and the unspoken understanding that the greatest honor is sometimes just to be remembered. And for Walter Briggs, that honor had finally come. A week later, Walter stood before a new chapter of his life, one he hadn't dared to dream of in years. The Briggs Automotive Center stood proudly at the edge of town, its sign gleaming under the morning sun, The bold, clean letters a testament to a legacy forged in sand, sweat, and sacrifice. The building was more than Walter could have imagined. 5 spacious bays with spotless floors, modern lifts humming with possibility, a break room with cool air conditioning, and an upstairs apartment where Walter now lived. His dog, Buddy, had already claimed the corner couch as his throne, sprawled out with the contentment of a king. But the building itself, impressive as it was, wasn't what mattered most. It was what it became. Within days of the grand opening, the first knock came at the door. A young man, Diego, stood there, barely 20, his hands fidgeting nervously. His father had been a soldier, but Diego's life had been shaped by addiction and poverty, a cycle he was desperate to break. He didn't know the first thing about fixing cars. He only knew he was tired of feeling lost. Walter's eyes met his, and without hesitation, he said, "Come on in. Let's get your hands dirty." There was no judgment in his voice, only a quiet invitation to start anew. Then came Mike, a veteran fresh from discharge, his eyes haunted by the struggle to find his place in a world that no longer felt like home. He carried the weight of his service like a shadow, unsure how to step into the light. Walter saw himself in Mike's uncertainty, and with a steady hand, he offered him a wrench and a purpose. Then Savannah arrived, her quiet determination masking the scars of her own battles. Each new face brought a story, and Walter welcomed them all, not just as workers, but as people searching for something to hold on to. The garage became more than a business. It became a refuge, a place where broken things and broken people could be made whole again. In a small, weathered trailer park on the edge of town, a teenager named Riley lived with dreams bigger than the rusted mailboxes and sagging porches that surrounded them. Once a straight-A student, Riley's grades had slipped like sand through fingers, weighed down by the chaos of a struggling family in a school that seemed to care less each year. But Riley's spirit hadn't faltered. They showed up every day, working odd jobs, their hands calloused, but their resolve unshaken. It was this quiet determination that led them to Walter Briggs's garage, a place whispered about among the kids in town, not as a repair shop, but as a sanctuary for those searching for a way forward. Walter, a man carved from years of grit and loss, never sought the role of mentor. His garage, tucked on a forgotten strip near the town limits, had once been a hub of activity, but time and neglect had dulled its shine. Yet word of Walter's quiet wisdom spread like ripples on a still pond. It started with Riley, who knocked on the garage door one humid afternoon, eyes nervous but resolute, asking for work. Walter saw something in the kid, a flicker of himself decades ago, before the army, before the world had hardened him. He didn't just hand Riley a wrench, he handed them a chance. Each week another knock followed, another kid, another story. There was Diego, whose quick laugh hid a home life fractured by addiction, and Savannah, who carried the weight of being the first in her family to dream of college. They came seeking escape, redemption, or just a place to belong, and Walter welcomed them all. In the garage, Walter taught more than mechanics. Sure, he showed them how to rebuild an alternator, balance tires, or diagnose a stubborn engine knock. But those were just the tools. What he really imparted was discipline, how to show up on time, even when the world felt heavy, how to take pride in a clean workspace, even if it was just a swept floor, how to believe in themselves when no one else did. For Walter, these lessons were personal. He'd seen too many people give up on themselves, on each other, and he refused to let these kids become part of that cycle. Every torque of a wrench, every scrubbed oil stain was a small act of defiance against despair. The kids felt it too. Diego, who once thought his future ended at the trailer park's edge, began to carry himself taller, his jokes now laced with confidence. Savannah, who'd spent years hiding her ambition behind a tough exterior, started talking about engineering school, her voice steady with possibility. The garage itself seemed to come alive again, its pulse no longer just the hum of engines, but the rhythm of human connection. Laughter echoed off the cinder block walls, mingling with the clank of tools and the occasional curse when a bolt wouldn't budge. For Walter, it felt like the camaraderie of his army days, back when he believed in something bigger than himself, before the weight of war and loss had quieted that part of him. He watched the kids work, their hands growing surer with each task, and felt a flicker of pride he hadn't known he could still feel. It wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about fixing something deeper, something that lingered in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. The town began to notice the change. Old customers, who'd once driven past the garage without a glance, started returning. They brought their creaking sedans and rattling pickups, but soon they brought more. Their own kids, their stories, their need for connection. A woman named Clara, whose husband had left her to raise 3 boys alone, showed up one day with her car and stayed to talk, her voice cracking as she thanked Walter for giving her oldest son purpose. A man named Tom, who'd known Walter since high school, stopped by just to sit and reminisce, his laughter filling the gaps where words weren't needed. The garage became a gathering place, a beacon for those who'd felt forgotten by the town's rush to modernize. Local businesses took note too. The bakery down the street, run by a woman named Marla who'd seen her own share of hard times, started sending over a tray of bagels every Wednesday morning. The kids devoured them, their chatter filling the air as they passed the tray around, and Walter would nod his thanks to Marla from across the counter when he picked up his coffee. A retired accountant named Harold, who'd spent his career crunching numbers in a cubicle, offered to sort out the garage's books, his meticulous spreadsheets bringing order to Walter's chaotic receipts. Even City Hall, usually more concerned with glossy redevelopment plans than the town's frayed edges, sent a representative to the garage one quiet afternoon. She asked, almost hesitantly, if Walter would consider joining the Community Redevelopment Board. His weathered face gave nothing away as he listened, his silence neither a yes nor a no, but a promise to think it over. For Walter, it wasn't about recognition. It was about the work, the kids, the quiet rhythm of a place that mattered. The street outside the garage began to transform too. Once a desolate stretch of cracked pavement and overgrown weeds, it started to hum with life. Neighbors waved as they passed, kids on bikes lingered to watch the garage's bustle, and the air carried the faint scent of possibility. Walter's garage wasn't just a business anymore. It was a proving ground, a place where second chances weren't handed out like charity, but earned through sweat and determination. The town, so quick to bulldoze its past in favor of shiny new storefronts, began to see value in what had been there all along, in the grease-stained hands teaching a new generation to build something lasting, in the stubborn grit of a man who refused to give up, in the quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return. As the sun dipped low one evening, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, Walter sat on the porch of his small apartment above the garage. His elbows rested on his knees, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his rough hands, the warmth seeping into his palms. Beside him lay Buddy, his old dog, whose graying muzzle and slower steps mirrored Walter's own aging. Buddy's ears twitched at the distant sound of a car passing, but his eyes stayed half-closed, content in the quiet companionship they'd shared for years. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable, forged through countless evenings like this one, when the world felt just a little softer. Walter's gaze drifted across the lot below. The garage lights were off for the night, but the faint smell of motor oil and freshly cut grass still hung in the air. Inside, tools hung neatly on hooks, and drying rags were folded with care. Not perfect, but deliberate, a reflection of the lessons Walter had instilled. A faint laugh drifted from the side of the building. Maybe Diego's. Maybe Savannah's, as one of the kids lingered to finish a task or share a story. Walter didn't need to check. He knew the rhythm of the place now, knew the kids were giving their all, knew they were finding their way. He took a slow sip of his coffee, long gone cold, but it didn't bother him. Some things he'd learned were better when they'd had time to settle, to carry the weight of patience. His eyes, calm but often shadowed by the burdens of a life fully lived, held something new now, a quiet, hard-earned hope. It wasn't the loud, fleeting kind that filled speeches or headlines, but the steady kind, born from seeing the worst of the world and still choosing to build something better. Walter had never chased fame or medals. What he wanted was a legacy that mattered, one written not in ink, but in the hands he'd guided, the lives he'd shaped. He glanced down at Buddy, scratching behind the dog's ears, earning a soft grunt of approval. Then he looked up at the vast sky where a gentle wind rustled the trees beyond the lot, carrying whispers of a future unfolding. A voice, steady and certain, seemed to rise from the moment. Some debts can't be repaid, but they can be honored. In the distance, a garage light flickered back on. One of the kids had returned, maybe to finish a bomb, maybe just to be there. And Walter Briggs, once overlooked, now quietly unforgettable, sat with a rare peace in his chest, watching a future take shape just beyond his porch steps. In a small, weathered garage tucked away on a forgotten street corner, Walter Briggs worked with the kind of quiet determination that could easily go unnoticed in a world obsessed with speed and noise. His story wasn't confined to the four grease-stained walls of his shop or the solitary life he led. It was a testament to countless unsung heroes, those who carry the weight of their past with grace, their sacrifices woven into the fabric of everyday life. Walter's tale wasn't about seeking glory or settling scores. It was about showing up day after day with a heart full of integrity and a soul that refused to let bitterness take root, even when the world seemed to have forgotten him. Walter was a veteran, though you wouldn't know it from the way he carried himself. There were no medals pinned to his chest, no stories of valor boasted over a beer at the local bar. Instead, his service lived in the calluses on his hands, the faint lines etched into his weathered face, and the steady rhythm of his work. Fixing engines, tightening bolts, breathing life back into machines that others had given up on. Each turn of the wrench was an act of devotion, not just to the cars, but to the people who trusted him with them. He wasn't just mending vehicles, he was mending trust, offering a small piece of reliability in a world that often felt unsteady. Inside, though, Walter carried a quiet ache, a longing for connection, for someone to see beyond the grease-stained jacket and recognize the man who had given so much for a country that rarely paused to say thank you. The world around him moved at a relentless pace, always chasing the next big thing. New technology, new trends, new promises of a better tomorrow. But in that rush, something vital was slipping away. The sacrifices of men and women like Walter, those who had laid the foundation for the freedom so easily taken for granted, were being buried beneath the weight of progress. Every day, people passed by his garage, their eyes fixed on their phones or their futures, unaware of the man who had fought for their right to move so freely. Walter didn't resent them for it. Resentment wasn't in his nature. Instead, he poured his energy into his work, finding solace in the hum of engines and the satisfaction of a job well done. Yet, deep in his heart, there was a flicker of hope. Hope that someone someday might look at him and see not just a mechanic, but a man who still mattered. Walter's life wasn't defined by grand gestures or loud demands for recognition. He didn't shout about the wars he'd seen or the burdens he carried. His strength lay in his silence, in the way he lived with unwavering principle. When others might have grown bitter, he chose kindness. When the world seemed to turn its back, he kept his door open. There was a beauty in that simplicity, a profound dignity in the way he refused to let his hardships define him. He wasn't waiting for an apology or a parade. He was waiting for something smaller, something real, a moment of human connection that said, I see you. Your life, your sacrifices, they still mean something. And then, one day, kindness found its way back to Walter. It didn't arrive with fanfare or flowery words. It came quietly, as he always had, in the form of actions that spoke louder than any speech ever could. A neighbor stopped by, not just to drop off a car, but to sit and listen, to ask about the stories Walter rarely shared. A young couple, new to town, brought him coffee one cold morning, their smiles warm with gratitude for the way he'd fixed their old truck without charging them a dime more than necessary. These weren't grand gestures, but to Walter they were everything. They were proof that his quiet existence hadn't gone unnoticed, that his life still rippled through the community in ways he'd never dared to hope. In those moments, Walter felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. It wasn't about repayment or recognition. It was about being seen. His heart, so long accustomed to carrying its burdens alone, swelled with a quiet joy. He didn't need the world to stop and applaud. He didn't need a holiday dedicated to his name. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was the simple acknowledgement that his life, his work, his sacrifices still held weight. A hand on his shoulder, a kind word, a moment of connection that said, "You're not forgotten." Those small acts of gratitude were more powerful than any medal, more enduring than any monument. Walter's story is a mirror held up to all of us. In a world that races forward, eager to build something new, it's easy to overlook the people who laid the groundwork for our freedoms. The veterans, the quiet heroes, the ones who carry their sacrifices not on their sleeves but in their hearts, they're all around us. They don't ask for much, but they deserve more than a passing nod on a holiday. They deserve our everyday gratitude, the kind that shows up in small, meaningful ways. A conversation, a helping hand, a moment of recognition that says, "You still matter." Because when we pause to honor those like Walter, we're not just honoring their past. We're preserving the values they fought for: honor, humility, and humanity. And in a world that often feels like it's forgetting its roots, that's a legacy worth keeping alive.